Support for Ben Franklin's World and the Doing History to the Revolution series comes from the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 156 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Today's episode is very special because it was created and produced by Joe Edelman, an assistant professor of history at Framingham State University. Now, in addition to being the person who interviewed me in episode 100, Joe is one of my Doing History teammates at the Omohundro Institute. As the Doing History team and I outlined episodes for this series, Joe made sure we included at least one episode on the power of the press and communications in the American Revolution. And he did this because media, communications, and politics in the 18th century Atlantic world is his historical specialty. So when Joe asked us if he could produce an episode, this was the episode that made the most sense for him to produce, because he is the subject matter expert, which means you're in for a real treat. So with that, I'm handing over my mic to Joe, and off we go into the 18th century world of information and communication.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World and the Doing History to the Revolution series. I'm Joe Edelman, your guest host for this episode. Thanks to Liz for inviting me to work on this episode, and to all of you for allowing me to borrow Liz's microphone for this week. And I also need to thank Liz for that because I literally borrowed one of her microphones. In this episode of Doing History to the Revolution, we're focusing on communications and information. After a few weeks talking about the ideas of the revolution, today we're going to examine how those ideas were put into motion. The American Revolution was a period of intense political debate throughout the colonies. But of course, that debate wouldn't have been possible without people to put arguments on paper and then circulate them around. Groups of writers, editors, printers, and others worked together to make sure that the arguments people had, both against British policies and in favor of them, got to the eyes of readers. They did so through a variety of media, in particular through the printing of newspapers and pamphlets. What did that process look like? And how did the ideas and arguments of the revolution spread? Today, we'll explore those questions by talking with several guest historians about how communication worked. We'll especially take a close look at the publication of one of the most famous pieces of political propaganda in American history, Common Sense by Thomas Paine. But let's start with the big picture of communications in the British colonial world. North America in the 18th century was a big place, and contact with Europe required a weeks-long passage across the Atlantic Ocean. So what did people do to get information across long distances to their friends, relatives, or business associates? And how did they get news from far-off places? Alyssa Zuercher Reichardt may have some answers for us. She teaches early American history at the University of Missouri and is an expert on communications and empire in 18th century North America. In our conversation, she reveals how colonists communicated with one another in the era of the American Revolution. If a colonist in 1765 wanted to get in touch with someone who lived at a distance from them, whether that be a relative, a business associate, a friend of theirs, how would they contact that person?
So there are a few different ways, and in large part that's going to depend on where this colonist is, who exactly this colonist is, and who they want to get in touch with. So say, for example, someone's living in Philadelphia, and they have a contact in New York. Now this is fairly straightforward, pretty simple. The Philadelphian, they would send a letter probably through the Postal Service, which would connect Philadelphia to Trenton to New York. And they could also find someone, whether this is an acquaintance, a business associate, maybe a friend, who was traveling to New York, and they would give them the letter to carry. Now, this letter, by doing it that way, would be going through the formal postal service, but it's usually going to go along the very same postal road. So this would be someone traveling from Philly to Trenton to New York. Now, say, though, that someone is living beyond the Eastern Seaboard. They're not in a major colonial city. They could be living in the Mohawk Valley in New York. One place that they could be is maybe German Flats, an area that's, kind of on the edge of British colonial settlements, surrounded by what's Iroquois and Mohawk country. And the region, while it has a large number of colonists, it also has just as many kind of military bodies because of forts and whatnot. So they're in this region that's beyond the edge of the formal postal service, but still relatively connected to British settlement. Now, they could send their letter by messenger. Maybe they could carry it themselves to one of the towns like Johnstown. And then from Johnstown or one of the other major towns that are further east, it could be routed through the postal service. Now, of course, the postal service, because it's the very edge of the British colonies in 1765, it's a little more sporadic than, say, sending something from Philadelphia. Now, maybe instead they would entrust the letter to someone to carry it, even further east, so to, the edge of the postal service, so to Schenectady or Albany. There it could just be conveyed by the post. It'd be a relatively straightforward thing. Once again, also, if it was from Schenectady or Albany, you're going to have a large number of people, whether they be kind of people involved in business, people who are just traveling, who will be going down the Hudson River Valley to New York. So you could always send it with another bearer the way the Philadelphian could. But say this person in German Flats, as we said, it's on the edge of British settlement. It's kind of surrounded by Haudenosaunee lands. Maybe they know or they're an acquaintance of someone involved in the Indian superintendency. Well, then they could have this letter taken to the center of that. So Johnson Hall, where Sir William Johnson lives. And then it'll be routed by Johnson, who has his own networks, which, could take advantage of military couriers, of Mohawk and Oneida messengers, as well as kind of other bearers and people that he knows.
So whether colonists or military officials lived along the coast or inland in the continent of North America, there were lots of ways for them to communicate with one another on a personal level. But in addition to personal communication, colonists also produced and consumed news and public information. So, Alyssa, how did people find out what was going on in other places? And which places did they care most about?
Newspapers as news is one of the most important things that we're going to see just before the American Revolution. And colonists are looking at news and information that, no matter where they're from, is really shockingly cosmopolitan. It's very wide-ranging, whether this be news from London or from other colonial papers. But if you look at what these news items themselves are, it's going to be news from Europe, it's going to be news from Asia and the East Indies, news from other colonies. So if we think about what made the kind of, perhaps not the actual front page, but what we think of as a metaphorical front page, you find that top news is often far less local than it is global. Now, of course, large sections of newspapers were also devoted to advertisements, to shipping information, even things like poems, extracts of published works, travel accounts, plays, a number of things that, we think maybe even would be more literary. But of course, they had news. So what constituted a news item? It's not really the kind of professionally sourced article by a designated specific journalist like we have today or we would expect today. News in the 18th century, it's largely excerpts of letters. Quite often these are letters from military officials, government officials, sort of people who have provided their letter to a printer who can then extract it. You often find news items titled things like letter from a gentleman in Detroit or, on last Sunday, a letter arrived here or the following letter. Now, much of this news that was published, if it was not pulled from another newspaper, was pulled from these letters. And of course, once something is a letter extract published in the newspaper, it becomes news, and then it's going to be reprinted in newspapers up and down the seaboard, in London and elsewhere. And so that really makes up the largest corpus of news items. Most anything published in a colonial paper was already published, usually in very much the same words. Some of this kind of practice of wholesale reprinting, it's very common. There's been work about this that's kind of called it the mobile paragraph, about how, these set news items moved across the pages of newspapers that were regional, that were across national lines, that were across the Atlantic, kind of around the globe. And so in part, that explains why there's such wide-ranging news in colonial papers. In a paper like the South Carolina Gazette, a reader could find news from, other mainland British colonies, from the Caribbean, from London, from Europe, even from the East Indies.
That's really fascinating, Alyssa, especially when we think about just how much news and information colonists wanted from London and from Europe. How did they get their news from Europe? And can you explain how long it took for news to travel from Europe to the colonies and then around the colonies?
The news from Europe could come in a number of different ways. If it's, coming through newspapers, a lot of these are going to be newspapers that can move even on merchant vessels and people who are traveling across the Atlantic for business. But especially if we're talking about this period before the American Revolution, starting in 1755, you have this really important kind of institutional intervention, the packet boat, which is more or less a mail boat that goes between New York and England, Falmouth, England. And this boat is, officially designated to work with the Postal Service, and it carries all sorts of things like letters, but it also does very specifically carry newspapers as well. So, news starts to kind of really improve once we get to this era across the Atlantic, and things really begin to speed up. So, say in 1750, news is coming from London, and how long would it take to get to New York? Well, that would really differ once again based on, what the kind of movement of merchant ships and other things are. But once you get to the packet boat, things are moving, let's say, about a month and a half to 2 months to go back and forth. Sometimes it's quicker if you're very, very lucky. But generally, it's going to be about a month and a half between New York and England. But then to get it around the colonies, that's going to be, far more circulation. So if something's gone to New York, it also still needs to find its way to Philadelphia, or find its way to Boston, find its way down to Williamsburg in Virginia. And so that's really reliant on how efficient the Postal Service is in North America. And so the Postal Service, much like the packet boat, is something that gets really renewed interest during this time period. And so you get a much more efficient movement of information. So something could have taken, about 3 to 4 months to move from what's now, as I talked about before, Pittsburgh, back to London in about 1750, 1755. By the time you get to 1760, 1765, this news could move almost as quickly as 2 months, sometimes even faster than that. And so you really see this kind of compounding speed of improvement between the 1750s, the 1760s, and the 1770s, where suddenly information is moving about twice as fast as it was just a decade before. And a lot of this is because of things like improvement of roads, improvement of the Postal Service. But it's also just important because as news moves, as I talked about reprinting between various newspapers, you have many more newspapers in this time period as well. So they're all kind of circulating these same news items more and more efficiently.
You've talked a little bit in your other answers about the post office. Can you describe the role that the post office played in communication in British colonial North America?
Post office, it carries letters, as we'd expect, but it also carries newspapers. In fact, before major reforms that take place during the late 1750s, newspapers were carried almost free of charge through the Postal Service. And so it's not just letters, it's all sorts of media. The same way we think of the U.S. Postal Service as something that's carrying lots of magazines and other kind of media as well. So the Postal Service is important, one, for carrying all of this information, but it's also really important as an imperial institution for the British Empire. Most of the improvements to the Postal Service occurred during wartime. So during the 7 Years' War, which takes place in the 1750s and 60s, this major emphasis on improving the Postal Service occurs. Now, many of these improvements were not tied to moving colonial correspondence per se, but to moving military information. So many advances were tied to improving post roads that connected military communication lines, those chains of forts that kind of extended across Pennsylvania, across New York, and other colonies. The real impetus for improving this and why there was so much funding was that people were expecting messengers and expresses to carry military paperwork, military news across these channels back to New York, which is where the headquarters of the British military were. And most importantly, this is also, if we're trying to get information back to New York, where that transatlantic packet boat I talked about is. And of course, it was the first transatlantic mail boat. And so everything is kind of very quickly propelling stuff to move information for the empire, whether this is information for the military service, things for the treasury, but the postal office is really, really heavily invigorated by these efforts that take place during wartime.
The American Revolution was the last of a series of wars during the 18th century that Britain and France fought against one another, trying to expand their empires in North America. Alyssa, can you tell us about how those conflicts affected communications for and in the colonies?
So I'm just going to take this from the British perspective since that's relevant to what we're talking about today. until the 7 Years' War, many of the wars that the British Empire is fighting, they're going to be fought by colonial militias or by the British Navy. It was only in the 1750s, with the beginning of the 7 Years' War, or what some people know as the French and Indian War, that large numbers of British royal troops finally were stationed in North America, and not only along the coast, but deep into parts of the continent. And so it's no coincidence, once you have all these British bodies and, not just soldiers, but you also have these institutions, whether that be the Quartermaster General, the Secretary's Office, the Ordnance, you suddenly have this major British military apparatus in North America stationed in New York. And it's no coincidence then that the British Colonial Postal Service is going to double in size and delivery during this era, because you suddenly have all of this information that needs to move to this hub in New York. So the Postal Service greatly expands, it really improves its delivery. There are all sorts of efforts to really improve this, and specifically to pull it towards ports that are on the edges of the British colonies, all to bring it back to this consolidated hub where the transatlantic packet boat is and where all these offices are, where people are compiling this information. So, this kind of drive to improve military communication means also, the improvement not just of these pathways of military paperwork, but ultimately, if you're going to be improving the Postal Service, you're also improving the avenues with which, colonists, traders, other people can use these information pathways as well. The argument I'm trying to make here isn't, that the military comes and suddenly communications are great, but it's that the British Empire really specifically focused on improving communications because they saw it vital to the war effort. And they, in this war effort, they're not just interested in improving the Postal Service and improving military communications, but they actually saw a great benefit to things like newspapers as well, because they provided news. If you had, a post commander far away, but they got this newspaper, they would know that an event had happened. And so it's kind of all working together. And so because of this rise in newsprint, this rise in propaganda that we all see before the American Revolution, it's not just because of, a growth of the public sphere, but we actually owe a great debt to the British imperial state, and specifically to the British Royal Army, that really, really rapidly improved communications, not just in North America, but also transatlantically.
As Alyssa just revealed, colonists were hungry for news, and during the 1760s and 1770s, they were very interested in reading about politics. The two most common ways to do that? In newspapers and in pamphlets. Newspapers in this time period contained a diverse set of news and information, most of it from outside the locale where the newspaper was printed. So how did printers get the news to put into their newspapers? And how did they choose which news to print? Getting the news in revolutionary America required a long chain of people connected across the Atlantic Ocean and at key points throughout the colonies. Now, most newspapers in revolutionary America were printed weekly, and it took most of that time to gather enough material just to publish a 4-page issue. Most papers contained lots of advertisements for local goods and services, which meant that about 2.5 or so pages remained for news. Printers would usually fill these pages with news from other places, because readers could find out about local happenings at their coffee house or tavern. As we discovered with Alyssa, colonists were deeply interested in what was happening in London, and so printers often devoted considerable space to British news. Then, printers would add in news clipped from other newspapers in the colonies to fill in the rest. As the conflict between the colonies and Britain heated up, printers added more and more colonial news. So readers in New York, for example, could find out about the Sons of Liberty in Boston. Readers in Newport could learn more about town meetings in Philadelphia. Or readers in New Haven could find out about the actions of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. Sharing this news also helped shape events, because colonists would mimic what they read about how others reacted. Newspapers, therefore, offered a chronicle of events, mixed with longer essays on the political questions at stake in the imperial crisis. And when colonists wanted to read longer versions of those arguments, they turned to pamphlets. So what did pamphlets look like, and who bought and read them? Pamphlets are worth exploring because they help us make the connection between the ideas of the American Revolution, its ideological origins, and how those ideas ended up in people's hands. Eric Slauter is a great guide to help us understand the role of pamphlets in spreading revolutionary ideas. He's an English professor at the University of Chicago and director of the Carla Scherer Center for the Study of American Culture. He's the author of The State as a Work of Art, The Cultural Origins of the Constitution. In his work, Eric has written widely on the relationship between print media and the American Revolution. Eric, we know that pamphlets were popular during the imperial crisis and the American Revolution as a way to publicize political arguments. Can you tell us about pamphlets in this time period? What did they look like, and how were they sold?
Yeah, at its most basic, pamphlet is a small book. It would be delivered to a reader in sheets stitched. Typically, the pamphlets of the American Revolution are octavo in size. That is a term of art that means that they're about 6 by 9 inches in dimension, smaller a little bit if trimmed. An octavo is made from a sheet of paper. It allows for 16 separate pages to be printed on the front and back. So a 16-page pamphlet would take one sheet of paper. A 48-page pamphlet might take 3 sheets. When Paine's pamphlet appeared from Robert Bell in Philadelphia in January of 1776, it was, I believe, around 80 pages or 5 sheets. So that's what it is in form. Their cost was really depended on the length, the number of sheets of paper used, but typically between 1 or 2 shillings when a bound book might cost 3 to 5 or even 10 shillings. So a person might come by a pamphlet in a number of ways, either through a purchase at a bookseller's or stationer's. They might find a copy in a coffee house. They might find copies bound in a library, a company library like the Library Company of Philadelphia. They might receive them directly from the author. Sometimes authors paid to have their pamphlets published so that the printers wouldn't assume the risk for controversial matters.
So when an author like Thomas Paine or John Dickinson decided to publish a piece, what process did he or she go through to decide where and how to publish it? In other words, why did people choose to write pamphlets or publish their essays in newspapers?
Authors have different reasons for engaging in these debates, and printers have different rationales for helping to publicize those arguments. I think the case of Paine is a good one, and maybe the case of one of Paine's respondents also tells us something about the nature of this economy. Paine worked closely with Benjamin Rush, who seems to have connected him to Robert Bell, probably through a series of intermediaries. That seems to have been a kind of crucial aspect of the negotiations over the first printing of Common Sense. In the case of an answer to Common Sense that appeared and was quickly suppressed and in fact destroyed in New York in 1776 in March, in that case, the printer seems not to have known the name of the author, but received a text, read the text over, decided he would print it at his own account, even though it was an answer to Common Sense. He met with a good deal of resistance from a committee of mechanics in the city of New York after he advertised the pamphlet arguing against Common Sense. And consequently, members of that committee of mechanics confiscated and destroyed almost all of the copies. We seem to have 1 or 2 copies of a pamphlet called The Deceiver Unmasked, a really wonderful title about the unity of the entrance of loyalists. And this work by, I believe it was by Charles Inglis, was subsequently reprinted under a different title in Philadelphia. But in that case, we know that the author worked a little more closely with the publisher, even going so far as to trim out some of the more objectionable passages from the pamphlet, or what he took to be objectionable passages to the pamphlet. So there were a number of different routes to publication. Others might simply write letters to a newspaper editor. Some of the more famous series begin that way.
As we've learned from Rob Parkinson, Bernard Balin, and others in earlier episodes, there was lots of reading material available during the American Revolution. Eric, can you help us understand how that looked from the reader's perspective? What do we know about how people read all of these pamphlets and newspapers and other printed materials that they encountered?
I think it must have been a little dizzying. Even though the scale was smaller than certainly it was in contemporary London, people were seeing a lot of arguments in print in a very short space of time. And, we have certain pamphlets in which the printers apologize that the time it's taken to actually print a pamphlet, such as one in July of 1776, has actually outpaced the events that it's describing. And so I think things on the ground are changing so quickly, and it takes a certain amount of time and capital to set up arguments in type. And I think people probably felt that they were often maybe ahead of, in some ways, of the arguments, or events had eclipsed some of the possibilities of argumentation on the ground. Now, pamphlets by their very nature are ephemeral. They're meant to make arguments that are timely and topical, and often that means that their shelf life is very, very short. We might ask, who would want to read Common Sense after July 4th, 1776, or in 1777, or in 1787 when it was reprinted, I think, for the first time since the mid-1760s. We can learn a little bit from that production side, specifically around marketing and advertising. Some printers are taking out very long advertisements for certain texts, touting the kind of people who need to read it. Say, men should read it to their sons, and school teachers should read it to their school children or their pupils. Mothers should read it to their daughters, and so forth. That's, of course, a little bit of advertising bluster, but we certainly do have some confirmations of the different kinds of populations that are reading these texts.
One of the measures that scholars have used to judge a pamphlet's importance, in part because we don't know much about what readers thought, is whether it was reprinted. Can you tell us a little bit about how publishers decided which pamphlets to reprint?
Well, that's a question that gets us into the networks of printers during the American Revolution. Sometimes a printer might decide that a text was worthy of reprint because it had been successful in another area. Certainly, the case of Common Sense illustrates that really nicely. Others might think that a response to a popular pamphlet might also be a source of revenue. So when we take and consider the case of Samuel Loudon in New York, who reprinted a pamphlet against Paine, much to his consternation, since the pamphlet was confiscated and destroyed for the most part. He, I think, imagined an audience of readers who wanted to hear arguments against Paine. He may have been right. He may have just not been very politically canny at that particular moment. In some cases, reprints are being made because somebody is paying for them. In other cases, they really are thinking about potential audience. And I think, the numbers we know from certain pamphlets about sales and so forth suggest that not all of these items had the kind of ready sale. So, for instance, we know that there was a printer in Philadelphia, Robert Aiken. We have his day books, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the sort of books where he recorded his transactions. We know that he ran 3 ads for one particular pamphlet in 3 different newspapers in 1773, and that his day books record only 3 sales there. So I think, within the network of printers, people would learn fairly quickly what was going to attract an audience and what wasn't.
Now that we know how printers made the judgment about reprinting, let's return to how scholars use that number. Eric, is the scale of reprinting a good way to measure pamphlets against one another? And if not, is there another way? Is there a better measure that we can use to figure out how important pamphlets were?
I think it's an okay way. I think to a certain extent we haven't exploited the numbers in quite the ways in which we might, and I don't think we've really integrated the full print spectrum of the American Revolution. In other words, I think we've largely seen this from the production side. And our standard bibliographies, the really wonderful ones by Thomas R. Adams, these tend to cohere in format. In other words, pamphlets, but not broadsides, not longer books, and so forth. They cohere around literary style, prose instead of poetry or drama, even though we know that the political pamphlets of the American Revolution include quite a few instances of poetry and drama, as well as prose polemic. We tend to segregate them out based on national origin. Were they printed in America or were they printed in Great Britain? So we don't really reconstruct the experience of readers when we do that. We tend to distinguish the pamphlets from the newspapers. We segregate the texts that start in Britain from those emerge in America. In large part, I think what we're doing when we count these things is we're looking at availability. And that's certainly one indirect way of thinking about influence. But we're taking availability as if it were or as if it was a kind of metric for reception or for the way in which something is read. And I think that's probably our mistake.
In an essay you wrote on reading and radicalization during the American Revolution, you outlined the argument other scholars have made that, quote, books make revolutions. Can you explain what that means? And is that how you want scholars to approach the history of printing in the American Revolution?
The question is still an interesting one. I don't think it's a resolvable one. I think a lot of factors contribute to the American Revolution. We now tend to put these pamphlets and the broadsides and the newspapers and the various other printed artifacts of the American Revolution back into the dialogue they enjoyed in their period, which was a dialogue with sermons by ministers, with street activities, riots and house destructions and so forth, and large rituals of performance and so forth. These are all things that challenged print and gave print a kind of special meaning during the Revolution. But I still think, as I thought back in that essay you mentioned, that it's hard to imagine the American Revolution without thinking about the radicalization of readers. And, in that we sort of share not a post-revolutionary idea, but really a pre-revolutionary idea. It's really striking to me how many commentators in the run-up to the American Revolution pointed to what colonists were reading as a cause for the present discontent, as Burke once put it. So in the pre-revolutionary period, we have someone like Benjamin Franklin himself finishing the first part of his autobiography. He's sitting in Jonathan Shipley's house outside of London, and he's writing the first part of his life. He gets to the creation of the Library Company of Philadelphia, and he ends by saying that, this library that he helped create in the 1730s was the mother of all North American subscription libraries that have become so numerous recently and have contributed in no small degree to the stand that the colonists had taken in defense of their privileges. So he telescopes from the 1730s and the creation of this library to the moment in 1771 when he's writing. I think we definitely do need to have a lot more attention to the complexity of this moment, to integrating all of those different kinds and styles and formats of publications, not just pamphlets, and more attention to the ways in which printers marketed revolution and the ways in which readers consumed it.
During the Revolutionary era, American colonists had a lot of reading material in front of them, whether in the newspapers that appeared weekly or, as Eric just revealed, in pamphlets. Authors and publishers paid careful attention to what arguments might be popular and always looked for ways to make money. And in recent years, scholars have used the scale of reprinting as one way to show what pamphlets were most popular. But how did authors and printers market revolution? How did that work shape the arguments colonists made for independence? And what can we learn about pamphlets by looking at Thomas Paine? Before we investigate these questions, Liz should tell you a bit about our sponsor, because they've helped make the research and production of this episode possible.
Thanks, Joe, and you're welcome for that mic loan. This episode is brought to you by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943. In partnership with the Journal of the Early Republic, the William and Mary Quarterly is publishing a special issue dedicated to investigating the American Revolution. Why did not one, but two early American history journals decide to revisit the history of the American Revolution? Well, as we've been exploring, the American Revolution wasn't just one event, but a series of many events. Not just one response to a one-sided issue, but a many-faceted response to a many-sided issue, and well, there's still much more to discover. Take our friend Nathan Pearl Rosenthal, who you might remember from episode 76 about citizen sailors in the age of the American Revolution. Nathan has an article in this special issue of the William and Mary Quarterly titled Atlantic Cultures in the Age of Revolutions. Now, we know that the American Revolution formed just one part of the larger revolutionary era. And while there have been many studies about culture surrounding the American Revolution, few studies have explored the cultural climate in the wider world at this time. So, what do American revolutionary politics look like when compared with those of 1790 Saint-Domingue? Find out by considering Nathan's article for yourself. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/WMQ promo, where you can order a copy of this special American Revolution-themed William and Mary Quarterly for a listeners-only discounted rate of just $10.
Alyssa Reichardt helped us understand how American colonists communicated with one another, and Eric Slauter revealed what pamphlets looked like and how colonists read them during the Revolutionary War. That leads to another question. How were the people who made these pamphlets, those authors and printers, marketing revolution? Many Americans recognize the name Thomas Paine, mostly as the author of the pamphlet Common Sense, which first appeared in January 1776. It came at a critical moment. The Revolutionary War had started the previous April with the battles of Lexington and Concord, and by the fall of 1775, Congress had created a Continental Army and appointed George Washington of Virginia as its commander-in-chief. Washington and his army set up camp around Boston, surrounding the British forces under General Thomas Gage. In August of 1775, King George III issued a proclamation declaring the colonies in, quote, an open and avowed rebellion. In that proclamation, the king acknowledged the importance of communication. He noted that there was, quote, reason to apprehend that such rebellion hath been much promoted and encouraged by the traitorous correspondence, counsels, and comfort of divers wicked and desperate persons within this realm. So the king had declared that the fighting was indeed a rebellion. But many colonists still wanted to reconcile with Great Britain, that is, to find some way to restore peace and also remain part of the British Empire. By the beginning of 1776, though, a growing number of colonists were starting to talk about something else, independence. But making that argument was controversial. For one thing, most colonists didn't see it as an obvious solution. And more importantly, advocating independence meant that the colonists would have to reject British rule altogether, something many of them weren't ready to do even after 8 months of war. Thomas Paine sought to change the perception of independence as controversial by making it seem natural, more like, well, common sense. In January 1776, Paine wasn't a well-known figure outside of Philadelphia, and he wasn't all that well-known there either. He'd only been living there for a year and a half. So how much do we really know about his life? Why did he publish Common Sense, and what did the pamphlet argue? And how do historians view him and his work as part of the American Revolution? Let's turn to our next guest historian, Seth Cotlar, for answers. A professor of history at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon, Seth is the author of Tom Paine's America, The Rise and Fall of Transatlantic Radicalism in the Early Republic, which won the Best Book Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Seth, Thomas Paine is known to many Americans as the author of Common Sense, but we don't usually talk about the rest of his life. Can you tell us a little bit about his background? Where did he grow up, and how did he come to be a writer?
We don't know a whole lot about his early life, actually. He grew up in a fairly obscure background. He was born in Thetford in England in 1737. Thetford is a market town about 70 miles northeast of London. He was born into a Quaker household, fairly modest means. His father was a staymaker, and he followed his father into that trade, and he trained as a staymaker, which is a respectable trade, but certainly not something where one would get particularly rich from doing it. He then left that work in his mid-20s, kind of in the 1760s, unclear why. He also never wrote much about his own life. He did not write his own memoirs and was incredibly unrevealing about his own life. So this also makes it hard to figure out who he was and what he was doing before he came to America in 1774. So in the mid-1760s, he's working as an excise collector for the government, which is pretty horrible work because he's basically trying to track down smugglers and people who don't want to pay their taxes, basically, and extract money from them to give to the government, a government that most people thought was incredibly corrupt anyway. And so this is what leads to his first pamphlet, and only pamphlet that he published in England before coming to the U.S., which was a pamphlet making the case for excise collectors, his fellow tax collectors, basically, trying to explain to the English government why it is the work conditions of excise collectors should be better and why they should be paid more, treated better, etc. It was not a bestseller, needless to say. But it was pretty well written, and it did get some attention from folks there. But I think anyone reading that pamphlet on excise collectors today wouldn't necessarily look at that and think, oh, this was the guy who was going to become one of the most important political writers of the late 18th century.
That's an intriguing background for Paine, and it's unfortunate that we don't know more. We do know, however, that Paine left England for Pennsylvania in 1774. Can you tell us what motivated him to travel across the Atlantic, and what work did he find when he got to Philadelphia?
Like with many things, it's not entirely clear why he left. He did get married when he lived in a town of Lewis in the late 60s and early 70s. Never wrote much about that marriage. It seems to have ended badly, though we don't know why or how. He also seemed to have great frustration with his life as an excise officer. There wasn't a lot of hope for advancement and so on. So he went to London. He had spent some time living in London previously and was connected there with a group of tradesmen, kind of working men who were very interested in science. And it was probably through those networks of kind of both science and dissenting politics that Paine met Franklin and then asked Franklin for a letter of recommendation to go to Philadelphia. And so Paine got on a boat. I believe it was in October 1774. He arrives in Philadelphia in November 1774, bearing this letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin, which was a pretty nice piece of currency to have in your pocket. And so with that, he was able to parlay that connection into a job working as an editor for the Pennsylvania Magazine, which was edited by a man named Robert Aiken. And this was a pretty important magazine in the sort of political and literary circles in Philadelphia. And so by doing this work of editing the pieces that would appear in this magazine, Paine could come up to speed pretty quickly with what people were talking about in Philadelphia at this kind of raw political moment in 1775.
We know that Paine eventually turned from the Pennsylvania Magazine to working on Common Sense, which he wrote late in 1775 and then published in January of 1776 in Philadelphia. Now, this was about 8 months after the Revolutionary War had started at Lexington and Concord. Can you tell us about the political and military situation at the end of 1775? Why did Paine think that this was the moment for him to enter the political debate?
The way I sort of read his decision to write this pamphlet and then try to get it published is that never in his life was he a particularly strategic thinker. He just didn't really have a strong ability to read the political winds around him in the political sense, but he was brilliant at being able to pick up on the kind of cultural winds around him and what people were thinking and what ideas and arguments would resonate with them. And so my read on what happened with Common Sense is that he was spending a lot of time hanging out in taverns, as he was wont to do, and coffee houses. And taverns and coffee houses were profoundly sociable spaces in the late 18th century. It was not like a coffee shop today where you go and sit with your earbuds in your ears and read quietly or write in your journal. These were spaces where people went intentionally to argue with each other, to talk, to read newspapers out loud, etc. And so Paine was spending a lot of time in those spaces listening to what people were talking about in this really politicized moment of 1775 and basically caught all the winds of what was happening around him and translated that into this pamphlet that then my sense of the response of it was he shared it with a very small group of people. We don't have a lot of evidence about what their response was, but it seemed like folks were thinking, ooh, I don't know, this is a little much. And then finally, he found someone who was willing to kind of publish it and put it out there. And then it landed with pretty significant splash when it came out. And I think in part that what he did is he said the quiet part out loud. You know, he basically took what these sort of working class, middling men in Philadelphia were talking about amongst themselves and translated it into this printed document that made these really powerful arguments against the king, against the continued connection with Britain.
So in our everyday language, something that's common sense usually requires no explanation. It's something that you should just understand what it is. But that may not be as true for something that's an argument 250 years removed. So, Seth, can you tell us what Thomas Paine was claiming was common sense?
Yes. So this is one of the ironies of the pamphlet is that actually when it came out in January 1776, most people actually did not think it was common sense, what he was saying, what he was arguing for. There were a good number of people who did, but the claim that this was common sense was a rhetorical claim, not a factual claim at the time. But it worked really effectively because it did speak to ideas that were in circulation at the time quite widely, but were still perceived to be, maybe edgy is the right word. And what he drew from was this combination of Enlightenment science and radical Republican political ideas. And let me explain what those were. So Enlightenment science started from this presumption of empiricism. Anyone can perceive the world and can ask questions, can do experiments, and generate useful, meaningful knowledge, actionable knowledge about the world. So he came out of this scientific background where, again, just because you're the Pope or the King doesn't mean you understand gravity any better than a staymaker who went to listen to some lectures in London about it. There's this egalitarian epistemology, or this egalitarian sort of way of thinking about the world that to him was commonsensical. In Common Sense, he makes this argument about the foolishness of having an aristocracy govern a society is like having a hereditary mathematician, which is one of my favorite lines from the pamphlet, where he's like, look, if you're good at math, you're good at math, but no one is born good at math. This is something that anyone can learn, and if you learn it, then you learn it. But, a hereditary mathematician is just a dumb idea, just like a hereditary politician. So this is where, to him, what was also common sense was this belief in fundamental human equality, not equality of result necessarily, but equality of potential. And so, therefore, to him, the idea that some set of people were set apart, monarchs or aristocrats were set apart to run a country when everybody else's job was to just sort of sit and accept that and take that for granted, to him seemed nonsensical, not commonsensical at all. And he uses this story, this analogy in the beginning of Common Sense, where he describes the first political society as a group of people gathered around a tree to make the laws and the rules under which they shall all agree to live. And that to him is sort of what politics was. It's like, it's simple. We're all living here. We need some rules. Let's get together. Let's make the rules under a tree and then leave and then go back and we'll all follow the rules. It's really not rocket science. It's not that hard to run a country. Ultimately, as we've learned, it actually maybe is a little more complicated to run a country. But that was the rhetorical case he was making against this kind of Byzantine, complex British Empire that many colonists at the time were experiencing as an imposition, as tyrannical, as exploitative, and so on.
You mentioned that not everybody thought that the argument was common sense when he first made it. And a lot of people, even after the beginning of the Revolutionary War, still saw reconciliation as the more likely outcome of a conflict with Britain. Why did Paine reject that idea?
That's a good question. I don't know that he ever really seriously engaged with the loyalist option. I think he was someone who very much committed to this conclusion, which was that independence is the only logical, reasonable act to take in this moment. And he never, I don't think, ever seriously took on board the possibility of not endorsing that position. Much like with the French Revolution, he never really sort of questioned deeply whether or not the French Revolution was a good thing and whether one should support it or not. In that sense, he didn't really engage very deeply with the loyalist opposition, though they certainly engaged with him.
As we know, not all the colonists opposed the British or even wanted to be independent. Can you tell us a little about the responses to Common Sense from loyalists? Did they launch a campaign in print against independence?
Yes, well, and they had been campaigning against it for quite a while, as fans of Hamilton will know from the Farmer Refuted song in that play. So the loyalist opposition was longstanding, and Common Sense just became their latest target. And one of the interesting things about their critique of Paine is that actually many patriots shared this critique of Paine, like John Adams, for example, who, though John Adams was with Paine on the question of should we separate from Britain, John Adams actually agreed with some of Paine's loyalist critics in that he was concerned about these sort of analogies like politics is just a matter of people gathering together under a tree and agreeing about the rules they would live under and so on. Adams and loyalist critics thought Paine was unleashing the demon of democracy. democracy in 1776 was not a term that people would use with a positive connotation at that time. It was associated with anarchy. It was associated with chaos. It was associated with rule of the mob or the rabble, they would have called it. Paine himself did not use the word democracy in Common Sense. He didn't describe his ideal political situation as a democracy, but he was criticized for being overly idealistic about the capacity for people to govern themselves. People would make reference to ancient Greece and Rome, and they would point out that what will happen is some popular demagogue will emerge who will make great promises to ordinary propertyless people, and he will gain the popularity and the support of ordinary people who will then use the power of the government and this demagogue to take the property and the liberties of the wealthy and redistribute it. And that this would ultimately lead to a form of tyranny that would be even worse than the conditions under which we are currently living.
As you've mentioned, Thomas Paine had a high opinion of himself. And he claimed that Common Sense was the turning point in the debate about independence. Since then, a number of historians have agreed with him. How did historians come to think that way? And do we still agree with him today?
I don't know if Paine had a high opinion of himself. He was a confident fellow, but I think he was a good PR man. He understood the importance of having people perceive him as influential and important. And so Common Sense he undoubtedly overstated and exaggerated tremendously the number of versions of it that were printed and its power. But I think ultimately, historians looking back at the revolution have just taken him at his word, in part because he seemed like this trustworthy informant. He's Thomas Paine. He's the guy that wrote Common Sense. But I think also, Paine's self-justifying story about how important Common Sense was at the time fits with a sort of patriotic narrative that Americans have often liked to tell about the revolution, that it was an intellectual endeavor, that it was something that we thought about rationally, we engaged with arguments. Common Sense is filled with evidence and charts and numbers and things like that. So the idea being that this is a revolution that wasn't entered into rashly, it wasn't something that people entered into out of a sense of vengeance or hatred or self-interest, but rather was something that people thought about carefully, soberly, read pamphlets like Common Sense, and then made a rational decision that this was indeed the best path forward. I think that doesn't really describe the way revolutionary mobilization happened in 1775 and 1776 at all, but I can understand why people would have an investment in that particular depiction of the way that mobilization functioned.
One thing that's particularly noticeable about Common Sense, as opposed to many other Revolutionary era pamphlets, is that it was written in an accessible style. There's not a lot of legal or philosophical language in it. Why did Paine frame his arguments that way? Was it a way simply to appeal to a broad audience? And if so, why?
Paine didn't really know how to write in any other way. He was not formally trained. He had maybe 7 or 8 years of grammar school education when he was growing up in Thetford. But apart from that, that was the totality of his formal education. So he also clearly had read a lot of political writers, theorists from his day, but he never name-checked them. He never made arguments from authority, which I think was connected to his political vision as well, right? That if I have a good argument, it shouldn't matter whether Montesquieu said it or some other famous political writer. It should matter if this argument is compelling to you. And so that was his method of writing. He wrote, I think, in the same style that he engaged in taverns, in coffee houses, out in the public streets with his fellow citizens, which is that I'm going to marshal evidence and arguments and reasons and try to convince you as to why I think this is true and why this is the proper way for us to go forward. So I think in that sense, he really imagined himself as a tribune of the people, as putting it in too grandiose terms. I suspect that what he discovered over the course of his life in various debating societies and so on is that he was really good at standing up and speaking extemporaneously, listening to what people were saying, giving it back to them in slightly different forms or in crystallized form with a few nice rhetorical flourishes. I mean, when I read Common Sense, there's that line about sometimes nature gives us an ass for a lion when he's describing the foolishness of hereditary rule. And you just know that he pulled that out multiple times in various taverns in Philadelphia and got a good laugh. And so, boom, there it goes into the pamphlet. And I suspect that a lot of people reading that pamphlet were like, oh, yeah, I remember hearing him say that. So to me, that feels like kind of a transcript, a summary of basically what people were saying via word of mouth on the streets of Philadelphia in 1775.
Many of the pamphlets circulating in the 1760s and 1770s attacked British policies, and most of them made their arguments based on legal and philosophical principles. They aimed at an elite audience to convince those elites of the justice of the patriot cause. But Paine did something different. He wrote in the language in which people spoke, and saw himself, if not as the people's representative, then at least as someone speaking to a much broader audience. But if he imagined his audience as a broad one that included not just colonial elites, but also ordinary people, what do we know about who actually read the pamphlet? How far did it really spread around the colonies in 1776? And what role did Paine play in making common sense as famous as it now is? Our final guest historian, Trish Loughran, will help us address these questions. Trish is an associate professor of English and history at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and the author of The Republican Print Culture in the Age of U.S. Nation Building, 1770 to 1870. In her book, Trish explores the history of common sense, and in particular how a battle between Thomas Paine and his publisher shaped the pamphlet. In Common Sense, Paine wrote that the revolution was, quote, not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. Trish, what did Thomas Paine mean by that, and why did he try to portray the American Revolution so broadly?
You have to remember that the language of the Enlightenment is almost always the language of universals. And so when Paine says that America is the cause of a continent, he's sort of using this expansive rhetoric. There's this tendency in Enlightenment to try to extend rules to everything and everyone. But even within this sort of rhetoric of universals, Paine is always prone to hyperbole or exaggeration. In fact, I would say hyperbole is sort of his signal rhetorical gesture and gift. If something can be overstated, it will be overstated. If a mouse hole can be made into a mountain, Paine can do it more beautifully than anybody else. In the case of this hyperbole, this notion of a call for a continental revolution or a continental movement, I think this is a very attractive figure of speech for his readers. Because on one hand, he's trying to combat pervasive squabbles between provincial entities. People in Pennsylvania saying, I could never get down with people from Virginia to form an alliance. I have nothing in common with them. Or people from North Carolina saying, those people in Boston, they are so different from me. I could never join with them. By calling for a continental alliance, he's basically trying to sort of quash these provincial squabbles. And he's also addressing, I think, a kind of fear that many people had in the 1770s that they were going to lose out if they separated from the British Empire. So I think this idea of a continental alliance sort of compensates. The idea of a continent is a compensatory rhetoric alongside the idea of no longer being part of the empire. I always think of Benjamin Franklin's famous cartoon, Join or Die, where you have like the sort of chopped up snake that's labeled as different pieces are labeled as colonies. You know, Franklin's way of trying to get people to join an alliance was to say, join or die, do it or else. Whereas Paine says, no, it's not join or die. It's come be part of this amazing new thing that's going to be the best and the biggest thing ever. It's going to be bigger than the British Empire.
So in constructing that argument that the new continent-wide movement would create something bigger and better than Great Britain, Paine was pointing toward a future in which the colonies were both independent and united. Can you talk a little bit about how Paine constructed that argument and why he thought the colonies would end up being united?
Well, common sense is definitely one of the core places in Paine's canon where he makes this argument. In terms of how he makes the argument, I would say he makes it any way he can. In addition to hyperbole, he's a master of just using any argument at his disposal. So I would say that despite its title and its real wonder rhetorically, common sense doesn't really hang together as an argument. Its opponents actually dubbed it nonsense. And in fact, if you read it carefully, you can kind of see that they have a point. How he makes the case for independence is he'll make it, in regard to one kind of argument in one place, and then on the next page, he'll even contradict that argument and make it another way. He just takes everything he can. So to give some examples, a lot of his claims for independence are based on natural law. He argues that in the beginning of the world, men were free and that government is the badge of lost innocence, that British monarchy and empire are unnatural. And then on the next page, he'll argue for a government that is natural. So he uses natural law to his ends where it suits him. In other places, he cites what amount to, for him, archival sources. He cites the Bible, which seems to me not quite the same thing as natural law. And he also wasn't above maligning his British target to try to get them to look ridiculous. In the end, I would say he was trying to get his readers to believe that Americans could actually be more British than the British were, that the British were, a sort of corrupted form of natural greatness, and that to separate from them would allow Americans to carry the true mantle of the British Empire forward. And again, I think that these are ways of fending off the sense of loss that people felt in severing ties with England.
In the Republican print, you narrate the story of the publication of Common Sense. And after Common Sense first appeared in Philadelphia in January of 1776, Thomas Paine had a dispute with his publisher, Robert Bell. Trish, can you tell us what they were arguing about?
Sure. The original printer for Common Sense was this guy, Robert Bell. He was a Scottish Republican, well-known, well-respected amongst Philadelphia Whigs. And he printed Common Sense in part because Paine wrote it at the behest of well-known Philadelphians like Franklin, David Rittenhouse, Benjamin Rush. These men sort of worked with Paine on getting him to write the pamphlet. They sort of advised him, and I think they were instrumental in locating Robert Bell as the obvious person to print it. However, Bell did something that really upset Paine, which is that after the first printing sold out, Bell just moved forward and printed more. He didn't consult Paine. He didn't keep him in the loop. He didn't treat him as if Paine had a kind of property in this object. Instead, the printer sort of took control, took ownership of the text, and went ahead and reprinted. And this absolutely gobsmacked Paine and infuriated him. And his response was to take out ads in the local newspaper attacking this new edition and telling Philadelphia readers not to buy it, telling them that he was in the process of finding his own printer, and that when he did, he would release a new updated edition with more material, with improvements, sort of encouraging them to buy from him. So basically, it was an argument over what I would call sort of authorial sovereignty. Paine felt that he should have control of this text. It's pretty ironic, actually, because a lot of the founding texts in the U.S., like Common Sense or even like the Declaration of Independence, they're treasured because they seem not to belong to anyone. Common Sense, even in its title, seems to suggest that it's the property of everybody. And I think a large part of the myth of Common Sense is that it's the people's text, right? That people spontaneously responded to it, that it was read by everyone, everywhere, because it expressed not thoughts that were particular to Paine, but thoughts that were common. But Paine didn't actually see it that way. And actually, neither did Robert Bell. Both of these guys felt like they had a kind of interest in the text. And this led to months and months of squabbling between the two of them. It's actually kind of an epic, I don't know what you would call it. It sort of reminds me of, I'm thinking again of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton and the way he articulates arguments between people through rap battles. you could create an incredible rap battle between Thomas Paine and Robert Bell because they took out dueling ads that ran side by side in local newspapers, calling each other names and sort of airing their dirty laundry. Even though Paine is the master of hyperbole in this exchange, he was relatively tame, sort of meekly describing and why he thought he had been mishandled by the printer, whereas the printer just took out every gun he had in his arsenal. He called Paine a dog, a thief, and probably the worst possible thing you could call someone in 1776, he called him an Englishman, to discount him and to discredit him.
We know that the arguments in Common Sense spread around the colonies, and we know that Common Sense was reprinted pretty widely, but there are also wildly divergent estimates for how many copies were actually printed. So Trish, can you tell us a little bit about the mechanics and logistics of the publication process? How many copies of Common Sense were published, and where was it published?
There's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot we can never know in terms of hard numbers about a book like Common Sense. This moment in the history of printing is not a moment of mass culture of the kind that we'll see after the rise of steam printing in the 19th century. Every copy of Common Sense had to be hand-pulled by a human arm on a hand press in a local printing shop serving a pretty local group of readers. That's how print culture was organized in the late 18th century, especially in the colonies. It was basically decentralized and dispersed. And so there's a lot we don't know about these local print cultures, especially in terms of numbers, especially the numbers of individual copies that were printed in each location. The number we do know is the number of reprintings. Common Sense was reprinted 25 times, which is a pretty remarkable number for something written in North America in 1776. The closest second to that would be a speech by Jonathan Shipley that was reprinted 12 times, or John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which was reprinted 7 times. So those are pretty weak numbers against 25 reprintings for Common Sense. But let's think about it. There were 25 reprintings of Common Sense, but 16 of these are in Philadelphia. And you have to remember that Philadelphia had these dueling editions. You had the original printer Bell printing out his editions, and then there was also a competing edition printed by Bradford's, which was Paine's printer, and offered Paine extended edition. So in Philadelphia, we have 16 editions, and then the other 9 editions are printed mostly in the Northeast. There are multiple editions in Boston, there are multiple editions in New York, and then there are some single editions along the Post Road and other places in the Northeast. Of these 25 editions, only one of them is reprinted south of Philadelphia. There was an edition in Charleston. So to me, this is really interesting because Common Sense is always evoked as ubiquitous. It was everywhere. It was reprinted in every town and read by everyone. But when you look at this reprinting history, as impressive as those 25 editions are, we see that it wasn't reprinted everywhere and it wasn't read by everyone. You might think that because Philadelphia produced 16 editions, that it serviced the demand for places where it couldn't be reprinted. That, it would be reasonable to think, for instance, that Philadelphia served demand to the South and that it wasn't reprinted South, but it was still distributed and read to the South. But I don't actually think that that's true. Certainly some copies from Philadelphia went south. Congressional delegates, I'd say, were responsible for sending small number of copies home and getting local printers to print them. They would send them with instructions often, say, hey, this is what's going on in Philadelphia. Please reprint this at home. But large numbers of a pamphlet like Common Sense were not likely to circulate away from Philadelphia in high numbers. There was just no infrastructure for distributing them in that way. Because within this sort of world of local production, one copy would migrate and be reprinted, but if it wasn't reprinted, you wouldn't see huge numbers of it.
Trish, can you tell us a little bit about the role that Thomas Paine himself played in how we think about the publication and what his estimates were of how often it was republished?
Despite the fact that we don't actually have hard evidence about circulation numbers for Common Sense, There actually is a tradition in American history books of citing numbers. One very common number that is cited is 120,000 copies in 3 months. Another number is 150,000 copies overall. And both of these numbers come from Thomas Paine. Paine responded to attack on the pamphlet by claiming circulation as a basis for populist approbation. So when he was attacked, he would say, "You're crazy. 120,000 of these things were purchased within 3 months." And that shows its power. That shows how important it is. That shows how right I am. Indeed, that number, 120,000 in 3 months, which we still often see in sort of popular history books, that was a number Paine came up with when he was in the middle of a newspaper debate with somebody anonymously writing under the pen name Cato was attacking him. And his response was to cite this number. So, Paine came up with these numbers, but as far as I can tell, they were complete fabrication. Paine was not involved in the dissemination of common sense to its different reprint sites. And even when he comes up with the number 120,000 within 3 months, first of all, he comes up with that number before he had even reached the 3-month mark. He was a few days, I think, shy of 3 months when he made that estimate. And not all the reprints of it were completed at that point. I mean, we're talking about wintertime conditions in some places in North America. We're talking about wartime conditions. Boston was occupied. There were paper shortages. Some printers had buried their presses. In the South, some presses had been seized by the British. So it was a fairly disruptive moment for printers in early 1776. And Paine just sort of fabricates this number without really having any hard knowledge. He's not in communication with any printers. We have no evidence that anyone consulted him or that he himself read the pamphlet. He did carry a few copies to New York, but other than that, that's the start and the end of his involvement in the distribution of common sense. So his numbers are, I would say, puffery, authorial vanity, perhaps, but they've been taken up by historians because they certainly have a ring of certainty, but they're not really based on anything.
In the Republican print, you discuss how historians came to see Common Sense as the first American bestseller. As you just explained, is that something that we just get from Thomas Paine? And do historians continue to believe that to be true today?
I call this the cult of common sense, this pervasive belief that Common Sense was a bestseller. But one of the things I talk about in my book is that there's just this notion of the bestseller is really anachronistic. It's really, at best, a sort of industrial phenomenon. In early histories of the Revolution, in the early 19th century, Paine actually isn't really mentioned that much. He's not a particularly decisive figure for a lot of early historians of the Revolution. But by the late 18th century, as historians started to delve into archival sources and became more interested in sort of reading the text of the Revolution and the words of the Founding Fathers, there started to be this cult of common sense that emerged and this notion of the bestseller. I would say that Paine's certainty in giving these numbers, I think, was very attractive in the late 19th century and the early 20th century to historians that were looking for these sort of positive, numbers-driven ways of thinking about things. And even though I think we should actually know better, I think it's still a very attractive idea today to imagine that Common Sense was a bestseller, that everybody read it, that everybody responded spontaneously to it. And the reason is that it stands as a kind of populist icon for the Revolution. Its title, Common Sense, and the idea that it was sort of spontaneously adopted by readers everywhere, this gives a kind of populist legitimation to the Revolution. It makes it seem like it wasn't Paine's idea, it wasn't the Congress's idea, it wasn't elites. It was just these everyday people responded, and it just made sense. It was common, and it was common sense. One of my favorite lines from Common Sense is early in Paine's appended edition. He adds a preface, and I think it's the first line. The first line of his preface, he says, the sentiments in this pamphlet are not yet common, but they will be. And it's sort of this remarkable moment where this thing called common sense announces itself as not common sense. Paine basically says, the ideas you're about to read, they're pretty out there. And most people aren't going to agree with them. But eventually, you'll see that I'm right. So this idea that Paine was just speaking the will of the people for them, or that the revolution sort of emerged spontaneously as a sort of natural populist event, I think the cult of common sense, or the myth of common sense as a bestseller, tends to help along the idea that the revolution did not belong to elites, it did not belong to the few, it was not fabricated, it was not engineered, it belonged to the people. And for that reason, I think it's a pretty hard story to let go of. And I think it's pretty alive and well, not just on the pages of popular sources like Wikipedia, but historians themselves continue to be very taken with this idea. And there is some warrant for it in those 25 editions. But the more you know about those 25 editions, where they circulated and where they didn't circulate, I would say the more frayed that sense of a perfectly even, spontaneous, ubiquitous circulation becomes.
So why was common sense important? As we discovered from our guest historians, there were several reasons. First, the pamphlet was widely read and circulated, even if not quite as much as Thomas Paine wanted us to believe. But publishers printed more editions of Common Sense than any other pamphlet during the American Revolution. Next, Paine wrote it in plain language. As Seth revealed to us, Paine had probably used many of the stories in Common Sense during conversations and debates at Philadelphia taverns. Finally, in Common Sense, Paine argued that independence was necessary for the colonies, and just 6 months later, the Continental Congress agreed with him. Beyond his importance for the American Revolution, Thomas Paine remains a figure that politically active Americans turn to as part of the founding generation. People quote or refer to Common Sense and invoke Paine's name to marshal support for whatever their cause is. So how does looking at Paine in historical perspective help us understand why people remember him today? Let's return to our guest historians one last time to ask them why they think Common Sense continues to resonate, and what they think Thomas Paine's legacy is in the 21st century United States.
I think one of the things that Thomas Paine did is he encapsulated the state of American political debate in 1776 in a really clear, straightforward way. And we've inherited that originary moment in our political culture. And I think there's a good reason why Paine today is embraced both by the right and the left. Glenn Beck is a real fan of Thomas Paine and even published an edition of Common Sense. But also many progressives, even democratic socialists, claim Paine as one of their own. And I don't think either of them is wrong necessarily. So Paine belongs to all of us.
When you look at certain passages in Common Sense with their suggestions about a manifesto to be sent to foreign court, something like the Declaration of Independence, or his suggestions about a continental charter or constitution, as we might call it, or even the idea that conventions separate from the state legislatures must be used to help form constitutions, this very basic American innovation of the Constitutional Convention, was popularized by Thomas Paine. Even key phrases that we associate with the revolution, like phrases in our own Bill of Rights, like free exercise of religion, may have their origin with Paine and his description of what a continental charter should not allow the government to interfere with. So I think that's a huge practical and pragmatic set of things that Paine should be appreciated for.
So I think it's important for us to think of Paine and Common Sense from an Atlantic perspective, from a British imperial perspective. To see this as something that's not just, important for the American Revolution, but to really put it into this broader context of the way information, ideas kind of moved across the larger British Atlantic world. To see how things like ideas, prints, moved across not just the colonies, but these broader geographies, these different societies. And most importantly, that this is something that's happening in this period, and something that we think of not quite as modern, on the edge of modern, before we think of wide-ranging advanced communication. And this is important from a technological perspective because the world's never really all that small. But But I think it's also important to understand that these debates, these revolutionary ideas, were never constricted. They were never, narrowly national or regional boundaries. The idea being that politics and ideas, these were traversing, the globe, and they were inspiring action in various settings. Paine, in a way, speaks more powerfully to the 21st century than he did to the 18th century. His belief in universal diffusion, this sort of cult of common sense as a text that could be everywhere at once, it sounds a lot like the current state we live in. It sounds like the sort of 18th century precursor to something we like to call the World Wide Web. I think that the Enlightenment investment in circulation, even the circulation of a book, the idea of universal diffusion, that is a foundational liberal tenet, and it has an incredible hold on us today. The idea of freedom of movement is very much conflated with ideas of freedom in general, and even with consent, the notion of political consent. So I would say a lot of our contemporary fantasies about the internet and about electronic communication have clear precursors in the myth or the cult of common sense.
Well, I definitely learned a lot. Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to take us through what the press and Thomas Paine really meant to the Americans' debates and discussions of the Revolution's ideas. Now, if you're looking for more information about Joe, our guest historians, and notes from today's episode, be sure to visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/156. Today's episode was made possible by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943. To get your copy of the special American Revolution-themed issue of the William and Mary Quarterly for that listener-only price of just $10, visit benfranklinsworld.com/WMQ I'd also like to offer a special thank you to David Fudge, who agreed to let us use his recording of the 18th century letterpress and ink blotting sounds you heard at the start and throughout this episode. David, this was great sound. Thank you so much. Finally, what do you think Thomas Paine and common sense really meant to the American Revolution? Do you think Paine and his pamphlet were important to the cause? Share your ideas with me. Send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.